Before I dive into my story, I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you'd consider subscribing to my channel, it would mean the world to me and help me keep sharing more stories like this. Thank you so much for being here. I am Nora Hollis, and I can tell you exactly where I stood in my family the night a ballroom full of donors raised their glasses, and the MC drew out my name like he was guessing at a crossword. Noel. As if an extra vowel could make me easier to place. My card at the end of the head table said guest in crisp black print, and in a looping hand my mother had written over it, earn your own money, while my father slid a folded confirmation of a $10 million transfer across the linen toward my sister, and everyone clinked crystal without looking in my direction. The Gold Coast windows made the lake a sheet of steel, and the chandeliers threw little suns across the tablecloths. I stood with my camera strap warm against my neck and tried the kind of smile you learn when you have been told to be easier, lighter, less intense. My father, Edward, kissed my mother's temple. My mother tugged my elbow and said, "Not now, Nora," in a tone that sounds like love if you are not listening closely. And Sloane, bright and polished, thanked the board for believing in the next generation, while the donors murmured that she would do great things with that capital, as if capital could only do one kind of thing. I left before dessert and let the lake wind slap me awake, cut through the alley and steadied my hands by shooting the hard orange glow of service lights and the steam lifting from a vent. 3 days later, my father texted, "Grandfather's service is Tuesday at 11, chapel at St. Bartholomew's, family dinner Monday, dress formal, as if grief were a meeting with a dress code." Walter Hollis built Hollis Intermodal from a single warehouse in a leased spur, brick by brick and handshake by handshake. In his workshop above the loading dock, he taught me that what mattered was not the ledger, but the way late light hit iron, the hum in rails a mile out, the patience a lens can teach. When I told him I wanted to be a photographer, he said, "Then you'll need a good pair of shoes and a darkroom that doesn't leak," and smiled like that was enough. At the chapel, the lake wind pushed the doors, and ushers put me in the third row while the front filled with donors. A few old men from the yards, and the whole board. Sloane's eulogy spoke of growth and stewardship. My father's sentences were polished like his cufflinks, and the only time anyone mentioned Walter's hands, they meant how steady they were in a downturn, not how tender they were over a negative in the enlarger. In the receiving line, a man from the north yards took my hand and said, "Your grandfather brought you to the fence at sunset. You stood on his boots to see over the rail. You called the rails the lines that make the city sing. You were small, but you saw." I tucked his words in the pocket where the place card lived, sharp and impossible to put down. After the burial, we were herded back to Astor Street where mirrors were draped and the kitchen ran like a tight ship. I poured coffee and listened to the house sigh the way houses do when they hold too many people. And when the estate attorney, Marcia Delgado, asked to speak to the family in private, my mother drew the border with the edge of her palm, and my name hovered on it. Per Walter's instructions, Marcia said, "The reading is tomorrow at 10, off-site at the Atlas Theater." My father called it closed and inappropriate. She lifted a page like a baton and said, "He was specific. The location is part of the document." The Atlas opened in 1928, when movie palaces were built like cathedrals, a high plaster ceiling veined with cracks, velvet gone wine dark with dust, a marquee that once held 1,000 bulbs. I had shot it from the sidewalk and imagined standing in that dust. When Marcia unlocked the side door with a heavy key, the air smelled like old paper and damp, and something asleep woke and turned its head. We sat in the first row, my parents in their practice center, Sloane with her husband, longtime executives behind, and Lionel Pike, Walter's friend from before the second truck, at the aisle. Marcia read the bequests with a formality that didn't sound like him and still carried his spine staff gifts. A union fund, a sum to Lionel that flattened my father's mouth and wet Lionel's eyes. To my granddaughter, Sloane, she read. $10 million to be used at her discretion in pursuit of the work we discussed. Sloane lifted her chin like a crown had been set there. To my granddaughter, Nora, she said, a letter to be administered by my son, in the spirit of teaching her the value of $1. The silence that followed had a small, cruel lift at the edges, like people not laughing and enjoying that they are not laughing. My father set a hand on my chair. As executor of this portion, I can confirm there is no financial bequest, he said, and my mother's palm rested on my shoulder as if blessing me. This is for your own good, darling. Marcia did not blink. There is a private provision for Nora, to be shown to her alone, she said, and the room emptied, the noise draining like bathwater. It is not legally binding, Marcia said upstairs, an expression of intention. He made sure the legal work was complete. Mr. Bell, the Atlas's custodian and former projectionist, threaded a reel and said, "Your grandfather told me the girl with the camera will know the smell up here before the door opens." The projector coughed to life, and Walter looked out from the grain, sun on the right side of his face, and lifted a ring of keys. "Hi, kiddo," he said. "If they won't give you a room, I bought you a house for your eye. Not a house with a fence, a house that knows about light." The Atlas bloomed behind him in a jump cut, wrought and promise. He named what he had set in motion years earlier Atlas Theater, limited liability company, free and clear. Hollis Photographic Archive with rights to the work he commissioned and collected, including images he bought under a nickname that stuck, an endowment, independent, to keep me fed and housed for 7 years and keep the lights on while I figured out what to show. "They'll try to make you explain yourself," he said. "Let them think what they need while you do the work. If they can't see your worth, make your own light." He tapped the keys 1, 2. The darkroom signal I had known since I was small. When the film bucked to white, Marcia carried the metal case like something living and handed me a manila folder that felt like brick articles. Trustees. The careful words that keep things from blowing away when people lean on them. And at the bottom, a photograph of me at 12 with a camera too big for my hands and a grin like an open window. We brought the others back and the room shifted. Marcia read Walter's public statement about the Atlas as a public good and the archive belonging to the eyes that need it, invalid. My father said before she finished, "Contesting independent trust with extensive documentation is an uphill climb." Marcia replied. When he mentioned capacity, she cited evaluations and video with dates and witnesses. My mother asked what a shuttered theater had to do with our future. Sloane stared at my hands like they had done something embarrassing. Lionel smiled the way men smile after a long night and a first swallow of coffee. "Walt always did like a long game," he said. Weeks became sawdust and permits and plaster grit in my hair. Maeve Harrington, a curator who knew Walter from a small stage foundation, met me every Tuesday with a notebook and questions I had not yet asked the first sound at the door. Where photographs breathe. How much red makes a safe darkroom without turning it to a wound? Inspectors shook their heads at what time does to buildings. A landmarks hearing turned when a woman pointed at the ceiling rosette and said, "Because light deserves a ceiling like that." And the vote went our way. Mister? Bell brought coffee and stories of ushers in white gloves and Thursday cereals and a tenor who sang so hard a bulb went out in row 4. When we flipped the master breaker, the house lights blinked and held. And along the balcony rail, my own work weighted street portraits from Pilsen, winter lots after a blizzard, a pair of hands at a lunch counter, each print matted and signed by Northline Patron, the alias Walter used when he did not want me to know. In the office, I found a shoebox, invoices, a rubber band, a note. "You never needed my money to be an artist, kiddo, but paying the light bill on time keeps your shoulders square." I sat with it and cried in the quiet way that does not frighten anyone. A courier brought a letter from my father's counsel, offering to invest a portion of the endowment in corporate notes to benefit the whole family, with naming rights attached, as if a plaque could solder a broken seam. Marcia and I declined without explanation. My mother texted a mock-up with our last name in bronze on a side wall. I did not reply. Sloane visited while contractors argued about a stubborn pipe. She kept her hands in her coat pockets like she had been told not to touch anything fragile. I heard about the brunch. She said the card, the mispronunciation. She told me the company had missed a bid Walter would have won. that our father was not sleeping, that she had not known about the atlas. None of us did. We laughed when the pipe hissed. At the door, she asked, "Do you need anything?" "No," I said, "Thank you." She looked back once at the marquee letters spelling Walter's favorite title because it made me roll my eyes Metropolis and left without saying, "See you soon," which felt like a kindness. We set a preview by invitation only and sent half the envelopes to people I had photographed who had never stood under a chandelier, and half to people who could pay for good work and sometimes did. Maeve built a program that did not apologize for being serious. Mr. Bell practiced the projectors until his shoulders seemed younger. Lionel pressed a ring of keys into my hand and said, "Heavy things, keep you honest." My father's side filed a petition to freeze operations. A judge denied it in a short order that read like a door propped open by a shoulder. On preview night, the line curled around the block neighbors in winter coats, and donors and Blick shoulder to shoulder in the accidental democracy art can still make. I handed security the guest list. 2 names sat under "Do Not Admit," not as theater or revenge, only as a boundary drawn with a felt-tip pen and a steady hand. My father arrived in a tuxedo that looked like he had been born in it. My mother in a navy dress that would photograph well. Invitation only, the guard said. A badge appeared from a wallet like a relic from a world that ran on small plastic rectangles. The guard was polite. My mother's eyes met mine through the glass, like signal lamps. I turned toward the stage because the room had decided to breathe together. I stood in the circle of the stage lights and did not thank my family or talk about legacy. "If they can't see your worth, make your own light," I said, and the room answered with gentle applause from people relieved not to be sold anything. Not a vision or a story, just permission to look and feel and go home with their eyes a little wider. The photographs held the room, and the room held the people. In the lobby, a small boy stood on his father's shoes to see the lemonade cups, and the marquee buzzed when the sun hit it. A city weekly ran a column and named me correctly as the person who opened the atlas. The writer called the show "Lines That Make the City Sing," a phrase I had buried in the program note, and added that a prior gala brochure had miscredited one of my photographs to a corporate brand team. The credit is now corrected. She wrote, "It did not feel like triumph, just a window pushed open in a stuffy room." We registered the archive with a museum that agreed to help digitize without swallowing it, built a small fund for working artists with children, and took on interns from the community college whose resumes could not hold their resilience. When the first endowment check cleared, I paid contractors on time and slept like a person whose shoulders had finally dropped. My father wrote asking for a grown-up conversation about synergy and the optics of a divided family. I read it twice and shelved it. An offer followed for an honorary board seat with a parking space and a nameplate like a polished apology. I wrote, "Thank you, but no," and let the pen fall into Walter's camera case. Spring warmed the plaster, and the city opened like a fist. We hosted a teen workshop. Maeve taught the difference between pointing and seeing, and I taught the comfort of a tripod when your heartbeat is too loud. A girl named Lila photographed the underside of the balcony and clapped a hand over her mouth when the print bloomed, like the room had said her name back. Lionel told me Walter once fell asleep in the projection booth and missed a real change in 1956. The audience applauded the darkness like a joke, and Walter fell in love with a room that could survive a mistake. One rainy afternoon, a courier brought a Polaroid of Sloane and me at 7 on the stoop. Orange peels hooked in our teeth like tusks. On the back, she had written only the date. I pinned it above my desk next to the free portrait schedule and let it sit like a small, unargued truth. Later that week, Mr. Bell told me the atlas had a superstition about names on the marquee. You never put your own up unless you mean it. I told him I had chosen the name I would sign for the work that lives here, Nora Atlas. He nodded like a man closing a switch. There are 1,000 ways to define forgiveness, and I am too young to claim even 10. I know only that a year after the preview, I stood on the roof and the lake was a blue you cannot mix. And in the light that makes brick look alive, I remembered the first time I watched my own print rise under running water like a memory remembering me. Whatever else the year had been, it taught me to stand still and look at what I had made without turning to see if anyone clapped. People ask if I will go back, if there will be a Thanksgiving where the ice cracks and the past becomes manageable, and we pass the roles like a play with familiar lines. We'll see, I say, which is the truth you use when you are done auditioning for anyone's forgiveness. I lock the lobby doors, check exit lights, and take the stairs to the dark room where the safe light makes everyone look a little kinder, myself included. Above the enlarger, I hung the place card that said guest. Not like a trophy, more like a pamphlet left by a tour guide who told the story badly and wandered off. Next to it hangs a photograph of Walter in the Atlas stage door. One hand on the frame and a grin that comes from doing a thing no one asked you to do, and knowing it will matter anyway. When an image begins to rise, there is a split second that feels like a secret, whispered to me alone. In that moment, I hear the soft tap of keys on metal 1, 2, and think, if they cannot see you, you do not have to disappear. And if they tell you to earn it, you do not have to use their currency. Outside, buses sigh and the crosswalk beeps. The same family from the third-floor walk-up comes every Saturday because the little boy likes the way the marquee hums in the sun. Sometimes Lionel brings a bag of oranges and peels one at the concession counter like a soft rebellion. Sometimes I see Sloane across the street with a client, and if our eyes meet, we do not flinch. She lifts her chin and I lift my hand, and we let the city pass between us without taking anything we do not need. By the end of that first year, we hung 6 shows, took down 5 without breaking anything important, and built a habit of sending notes to artists whose work stayed with us after the walls went blank. That is the best part of the Atlas for me. The way a room remembers what it has held even when it is empty. The way the air is thicker where someone stood and cried quietly because an image recognized them. The way a floor holds the memory of 100 pairs of shoes without turning bitter from the weight. At closing, I touch the keys to the box office rail, a small tap to tell the room it has done well, and step onto the sidewalk to smell the kind of the night that means rain across the lake by morning. Once, as I pulled the gate down, a woman my mother's age said, "I heard about the way they treated you. They treated me the way they knew how." I said, "My daughter wants to be a painter. Let her learn the weight of her brushes and the sound of the light in her own rooms." I said, "There is a scholarship application on our website. She can come to open hours and ask questions. She doesn't need to bring anything but herself." The Atlas is not a lesson, and I am not a saint, and this is not an argument with my family I am trying to win. It is a place to be, a set of doors I know by touch, and a hum I hear before the lights decide what kind of evening they want. And it is the truest answer I have to a card that once told me to earn my own money, as if money were the only yardstick for a life. I keep that card because it reminds me of a room where I was not expected to be seen, and because now I know how to change a room by deciding who gets to come in. Before I leave, I check the list for the next event and see a familiar pair of names under Do Not Admit. Not because I am angry and not because I am sure, but because I am still learning how to hold a line without carving it into anyone's skin, even my own. On summer nights when radios drift up from parked cars, I pull down one of Walter's cameras and set it on the ledge and just look. It is heavy in the way the right things are heavy, the way a promise sits, the way a hand on your back steadies without pushing. If there is any magic in all this, it is that weight teaching me to stop explaining myself to rooms that were never built for me and to keep turning on the lights for the ones that are